June 1940. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann, 22 years old, Luftwaffe pilot, stepped off a train at a camp near Liverpool, his hands bound behind his back. His Messerschmitt had been shot down over Kent 3 days earlier. He, dejected, landed in a field, been captured by Home Guard volunteers who'd held pitchforks like weapons. The camp gates opened ahead of him. British guards in khaki uniforms watched without expression. Behind Hartmann, 30 other German prisoners shuffled forward. Pilots, sailors from U-boats, soldiers captured in Norway. All of them had heard the same stories during training, what the British did to prisoners. Beatings, starvation, humiliation. Hartmann's ribs still ached from his ejection. His face was bruised, but the pain wasn't what made his hands tremble. It was what he expected would happen next, what his commanders had told him would happen if he was captured by the British. A British sergeant approached, weathered face unreadable. He looked at Hartmann for a long moment. Then he said, in careful German, "Welcome to Camp 1. You will be treated according to Geneva Conventions. You will receive food, medical care, and shelter. Any questions?" Hartmann stared. He didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Because nothing in his training had prepared him for this. A British sergeant speaking German, offering medical care, acknowledging his rights under international law. What happened in the days and weeks that followed would challenge everything these German prisoners believed about their enemies, about the war, and about themselves. The gap between expectation and reality would transform how they understood what it meant to be human in wartime. To understand why German prisoners expected brutality in British camps, you have to understand what they'd been told before capture. Nazi propaganda had painted a specific picture of Britain and the British, a declining empire run by Jewish plutocrats and weak aristocrats, a nation of shopkeepers without military virtue, a people who would collapse under pressure. But also, and this was crucial, a people capable of hypocrisy and hidden cruelty. German soldiers, sailors, and airmen received briefings before deployment. If captured, they were told, the British would violate Geneva Conventions systematically. They would interrogate through torture. They would starve prisoners. They would use captives for dangerous labor. The briefings emphasized that Britain, despite its pretense of civilization, would show its true nature when holding German prisoners. This propaganda served a purpose beyond preparing soldiers for capture. It reinforced the Nazi worldview that Western democracies were hypocrites, that their claims of moral superiority were lies, that Germany's open embrace of force was more honest than Britain's disguised brutality. So when Klaus Hartmann arrived at Camp 1 in June 1940, he expected beatings. When Kapitänleutnant Ernst Weber, U-boat commander, was captured after his submarine was sunk in July 1940, he expected humiliation. When Gefreiter Hans Schmidt, infantry soldier captured in Norway, arrived at a camp in Scotland in August 1940, he expected starvation. Instead, they received processing. The reality of British POW camps in 1940 was bureaucratic rather than brutal. Prisoners were registered, photographed, assigned numbers. They were searched for weapons and documents, but the searches were methodical rather than violent. They were questioned by intelligence officers, but the questioning followed protocols. No torture, no physical coercion, just careful, persistent requests for information that most prisoners refused to provide. They were given uniforms, brown battle dress with patches identifying them as POWs. They were assigned to barracks, unheated, Spartan, but structurally sound. They were fed rations that were limited by Britain's own shortages, but adequate by Geneva Convention standards. Hartmann, sitting in his assigned bunk that first night, tried to reconcile what he'd experienced with what he'd expected. The British guards had been efficient, but not cruel. The camp commandant had explained rules and procedures in German. The food had been simple but real: bread, margarine, tea, a thin stew. No one had struck him. No one had even threatened him. Around him, other prisoners processed the same confusion. Some decided this was temporary. Wait until the British felt secure. Then the brutality would begin. Others thought it might be a specific tactic for air crew who were considered more valuable for intelligence purposes. Still, others began to wonder if the propaganda had been wrong. But accepting that the propaganda was wrong meant accepting that everything else they'd been told might be wrong too. That was too large a leap to make in one night. So they waited, tense, watchful, expecting the other shoe to drop. The transformation didn't happen through grand gestures. It happened through accumulated details, small moments that contradicted expectations so consistently that denial became impossible. 3 days after arrival, Hartman developed an infection in his leg, a cut from his ejection that hadn't been properly treated. He reported to the camp medical officer, expecting what? Neglect? Deliberate mistreatment? Instead, he found a British doctor who examined the wound carefully, prescribed antibiotics from Britain's limited wartime supplies, and told him to return in 2 days for a follow-up. "Why are you treating me?" Hartman asked in halting English. The doctor looked at him with mild surprise. "Because you're ill. I'm a doctor. That's what doctors do. But I am German. You're also a patient. Geneva Conventions require medical care for POWs, but even without that, I took an oath. It doesn't distinguish between nationalities." It was such a simple statement, such obvious logic from the doctor's perspective, but for Hartman, raised on propaganda about British hypocrisy, about the fundamental difference between Aryan and non-Aryan humanity, the idea that a British doctor would treat a German patient the same as a British patient challenged his entire worldview. At Camp 18 in Yorkshire, Captain Lieutenant Weber experienced a different kind of dignity. As a U-boat commander, he'd expected harsh treatment. U-boat warfare was brutal, and British merchant sailors died by the thousands. But when he reported for his intelligence interview, the British naval officer conducting it was coldly professional. "I won't ask you for information you're not permitted to give," the officer said. "Name, rank, serial number, that's all Geneva requires, but I will ask if you need anything. Letters home go through Red Cross. You're entitled to write once per week." Weber stared. "You'll let me write to my family?" "It's required by convention. It'll be censored, obviously. Nothing about military matters, nothing about camp locations or security. But yes, you can write home." That evening, Weber sat with paper and pencil provided by camp administration and tried to compose a letter to his wife. What could he say? That he'd expected torture but received male privileges? That the British were following rules Germany itself claimed to follow? He settled on, "I am well. The treatment here is correct. Tell the children I miss them. I hope to see you when this is over." When he handed the letter to the guard for processing, the guard, a middle-aged corporal who'd probably lost friends to U-boats, took it without comment or contempt. Just filed it with the others, for censorship and mailing. At camps across Britain, German prisoners encountered this same pattern. Expectations of cruelty met with bureaucratic correctness. Not kindness, necessarily. Not friendship, but dignity. Recognition of their humanity despite the uniform they wore. The library at Camp 21 in Cambridgeshire held German books, novels, technical manuals, even some newspapers, heavily censored for military information but otherwise intact. Prisoners could check them out, read in their barracks, discuss them openly. The exercise yard at Camp 9 in Lancashire allowed prisoners to play football, to organize games, to maintain physical fitness. Guards watched but didn't interfere unless fights broke out. The camp canteen at various facilities sold cigarettes, chocolate, small luxuries, at prices prisoners could afford with the small wages they earned from voluntary labor. No one forced them to work, but those who did received payment according to Geneva standards. Each detail was small, each moment unremarkable on its own. But accumulated over weeks and months, they built toward an undeniable conclusion. Whatever the Germans had been told about British brutality, it was false. By autumn 1940, many German prisoners faced a psychological crisis. The treatment they received contradicted their training so completely that they had to choose. Either the propaganda was wrong, or this decent treatment was an elaborate deception. For ideologically committed Nazis, the choice was clear. This had to be deception. The British were being nice now to extract intelligence, to weaken German resolve, to make prisoners complicit in their own exploitation. When Germany won the war, and Germany would win, this false kindness would be revealed as just another British lie. At Camp 1, where Hartmann was held, a small group of hardcore Nazis organized resistance to British corruption. They pressured other prisoners not to cooperate with camp routines, not to accept British attempts at civil treatment, not to be deceived by surface niceties. An Oberleutnant named Friedrich Müller led this group. He'd been a party member since 1933, a true believer. When Hartmann attended a camp football match, Germans versus Germans, guards just watching, Müller confronted him afterward. "You're allowing yourself to be softened," Müller said. "They give you games and books and medical care, and you forget you're a prisoner of enemies who are destroying Germany." "They're treating us according to law," Hartmann said. "Geneva Conventions." "Geneva Conventions are a tool of Jewish international finance to weaken strong nations. Germany follows them when convenient, ignores them when necessary. The British are doing the same, acting civilized when it serves their purposes." "Then why not just ignore the conventions entirely? Why go through the effort?" Müller's answer was immediate. "To corrupt you, to make you doubt, to turn you into a collaborator who thinks Britain isn't so bad, who maybe tells them things you shouldn't, who goes home after the war saying the British treated you well. It's psychological warfare." The argument couldn't be resolved because it rested on fundamentally different premises. Hartmann was beginning to believe that the British treatment reflected actual values, that they followed Geneva Conventions because they believed in rules and law. Müller believed all behavior was tactical, that kindness was just another weapon, that genuine principle was impossible in warfare. But the camp's routine kept undermining Müller's position. When winter arrived and British civilians were themselves suffering under rationing, the POW camp still received adequate food. When bombing raids hit nearby cities, German prisoners in camps were kept safe in shelters. When the Red Cross inspected facilities, they found conditions that met international standards. Not perfect, but compliant. Most tellingly, when some prisoners did try to escape, it was expected, almost encouraged as a military duty. Those who were recaptured weren't executed or even beaten. They were punished according to regulations. Solitary confinement for a specified period, loss of privileges, but nothing that violated Geneva Conventions. At Camp 18, Captain Lieutenant Weber attempted escape in November 1940. He made it 6 miles before being picked up by local police. When he was returned to camp, he expected harsh punishment for trying to escape, for wasting British resources, for breaking trust. Instead, the commandant called him in for an interview. "You attempted escape," the commandant said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. It is my duty as an officer." Indeed, Geneva Conventions recognize that duty. You'll spend 30 days in solitary confinement. Adequate food, no communications with other prisoners, daily exercise period. After 30 days, you return to normal camp life. Any questions? Weber was stunned. "That's all? What did you expect?" I don't know. More?" The commandant studied him for a moment. "We're not barbarians, Commander. We have rules. We follow them, for your people and for ours. Now, is there anything you need, books, writing materials, for your confinement period?" The question was so unexpected that Weber answered honestly. A Bible, if possible. I'll have one sent to your cell. That conversation haunted Weber through his 30 days of solitary confinement. He'd expected punishment to be about suffering. Instead, it was about rules, clear, proportionate, humane. The British were treating escape attempts as a military matter, not a personal offense. They were following law even when it would have been easier to take revenge. Not all German prisoners changed their minds. Some remained committed Nazis throughout the war, convinced British treatment was deception or weakness. But many, perhaps most, underwent a slow, reluctant transformation in how they understood their captors and eventually themselves. For Klaus Hartmann, the turning point came in spring 1941. He'd been in British captivity for nearly a year. The Blitz was pounding British cities nightly. He knew, everyone in camp knew, that German bombs were killing British civilians by the thousands. Yet the British guards continued to treat German prisoners correctly. Not warmly. There was distance, formality, sometimes barely concealed hostility, but correctness, following rules, maintaining standards even when their own cities burned. One guard, a corporal named Thomas Wright, had lost his sister in the Liverpool bombing in March 1941. Everyone in camp knew. Wright had received the news, taken 3 days' leave for the funeral, and returned to duty. Hartmann encountered Wright in the exercise yard a week after his return. They'd never spoken beyond necessary exchanges, but something made Hartmann approach him. "I'm sorry," Hartmann said in careful English, "about your sister." Wright looked at him for a long moment. "Did you bomb Liverpool?" "No, I was shot down before the Blitz began. But you would have, if you'd still been flying." It wasn't a question. Hartmann couldn't deny it. "Yes, if ordered, I would have. And I'm guarding you instead of hating you. Funny old world, isn't it?" "Why?" Hartmann asked. "Why do you do this? Follow rules? Treat us correctly when your sister died from German bombs?" Wright was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because if we don't follow rules, if we become like them," he caught himself, "like the worst of them, like those who kill prisoners, who torture, who abandon law, if we do that, we've lost even if we win. The rules aren't for your benefit, mate. They're for ours. They remind us who we are." It was the most honest conversation Hartmann had with a British guard in 2 years of captivity, and it crystallized something he'd been slowly realizing. The British followed Geneva Conventions not because they were weak or because they were trying to manipulate prisoners. They followed them because they believed rules mattered, that maintaining humanity in war was its own victory. By 1942, this understanding had spread through many German POW camps in Britain. Prisoners still escaped when they could. It remained their duty. They still maintained military discipline and hierarchy within camps. They still hoped Germany would win the war, but they could no longer maintain the belief that Britain was fundamentally brutal or that British civilization was a hypocritical facade. At Camp 21, Gefreiter Hans Schmidt, captured in 1940, wrote in a smuggled diary, "I've been here 2 years. In that time, I've not been beaten once, not struck, not deliberately starved or humiliated. The British are not generous. Food is limited, conditions are spare, but they are correct. What we were told about them was a lie. I do not know what other lies we were told." That last sentence was what many prisoners were beginning to ask themselves. If the propaganda about British brutality was false, what else was false? The claims about Jewish conspiracies, the assurances that Germany was winning, the whole edifice of Nazi ideology that justified the war. Not all prisoners followed that questioning to its conclusion. Many compartmentalized, accepting that they'd been lied to about British treatment while maintaining faith in other Nazi claims. But for some, the crack in the ideology became a fracture that eventually brought the whole structure down. The full impact of British treatment of German POWs only became clear after the war, when prisoners returned home to a destroyed Germany and tried to process what they'd experienced. In 1947, Klaus Hartmann, repatriated to a devastated Hamburg, attempted to explain his captivity to his younger brother who'd fought on the Eastern Front. "The British treated you correctly?" his brother asked, disbelieving. "According to Geneva Conventions?" "Yes." "The whole time? Even during the Blitz? Even when their cities burned?" "Yes." His brother was quiet for a moment. Then, "The Russians didn't. In the camps in the East, millions died. Starvation, exposure, execution. Geneva Conventions meant nothing." "I know," Hartmann said. "Then we were lucky you were captured by the British." "Lucky isn't the word. The British made a choice. They chose to follow rules even when it cost them resources, even when their people were dying, even when following rules meant treating enemies with dignity. That's not luck. That's civilization." His brother looked at him strangely. "You sound like you respect them." "I do," Hartmann said. "I fought against them. I killed British pilots in combat, but I respect them. Because they showed me that humanity doesn't have to end when war begins." Thousands of German prisoners returned from British captivity with similar stories. Not of luxury or comfort. Conditions in camps had been hard, especially during the war's peak years, but of correctness, of rules followed, of dignity maintained. These stories complicated the post-war narrative in Germany. The Nazi regime had collapsed, its ideology discredited by defeat and the revelation of its atrocities. But many Germans struggled with how to understand the war, their participation in it, their relationship with former enemies. The testimony of POWs who'd been in British camps provided a counterpoint. Proof that the war could have been fought differently, that maintaining human standards in conflict was possible, that not all sides abandoned civilization equally. Ernst Weber, the U-boat commander, became a teacher in post-war Hamburg. He taught history, and every year he told his students about his experience as a POW in Britain. "I expected torture," he told them. "I expected brutality. Instead, I received medical care when I was ill, male privileges to write home, and punishment that followed law when I tried to escape. The British didn't do this because they loved us. They did it because they believed rules mattered more than revenge." He paused, looking at the young faces before him. Children born after the war, trying to understand what their parents and grandparents had done, trying to build a new Germany from the ruins of the old. "Learn from this," he said. "Learn that how you treat enemies says more about you than about them. Learn that maintaining civilization in war is harder than abandoning it, but infinitely more important. Learn that the British, who had every reason to hate us, chose dignity over vengeance. That's the kind of nation you should aspire to build." In 1973, nearly 30 years after the war's end, Klaus Hartmann returned to Britain for the first time since his repatriation. He was 55 years old now, a successful architect in Hamburg, father of 3, grandfather of 1. He'd built a good life from the ruins. He went to Liverpool, to the site of the former Camp 1, which was now a housing estate. Nothing remained of the camp, the barracks, the wire, the watchtowers, all gone. But he remembered exactly where it had been. At a pub near the old campsite, he met Thomas Wright, the guard who'd lost his sister in the bombing. They'd kept in sporadic correspondence over the years, Christmas cards mostly, brief updates on life. Wright was 60 now, retired from a career in civil service, grandfather of 4. They sat in the pub, 2 old men who'd once been on opposite sides of a war, drinking beer and talking about children and grandchildren and the peculiar distance of history. "I've always wanted to ask," Hartmann said. "That day in the exercise yard, when I said I was sorry about your sister, were you angry with me?" Wright considered the question carefully. "Yes," he finally said. "I was angry. Angry at you, at all of you, at the whole bloody war. But I was also angry at myself for being angry at prisoners who were just following orders, same as me. So why were you kind? Why explain about rules and civilization? Because you asked. Because you seemed to genuinely want to understand, and because explaining it to you helped me understand it myself. I was following rules because someone told me to, but saying it out loud, explaining it to an enemy, made me realize I believed in those rules, that they meant something. Hartman smiled slightly. You changed my life, you know. That conversation, it made me question everything I'd been taught. Not immediately, not all at once, but the seed was planted. I didn't do anything special, just followed regulations. That's my point. You followed regulations when you could have taken revenge. You maintained standards when it would have been easier to abandon them. You showed me that civilization could survive war. That's not nothing. Wright was quiet for a moment, looking into his beer. Then he said, "We won the war, Klaus, but I've often wondered if we won it the right way. We bombed German cities, killed civilians, did things that in quieter moments I'm not proud of. But in the camps, with prisoners, there at least we did it right. We maintained standards, and if that helped even one German prisoner question what he'd been taught, then maybe those rules did more to end Nazism than all our bombs." They sat in comfortable silence. Two old enemies who'd become something like friends, bound by shared history and mutual respect earned through the treatment of prisoners in a long-ago war. "I tell my grandchildren about the war," Hartman said. "I tell them I was a prisoner in Britain, and I tell them the British treated me with dignity when they had every reason not to. I want them to understand. That's what civilization means. That's what we lost in Germany when we followed Hitler. That's what we're trying to build back." Wright raised his glass. "To civilization, then. May it survive our wars." "To civilization," Hartman echoed. They drank, two old men in a Liverpool pub, carrying between them the memory of a time when one nation chose dignity over vengeance, rules over revenge, and in doing so proved that humanity could survive even in war's darkest moments. The camps are gone now. The prisoners have mostly passed away, the guards too, but the lesson remains, preserved in memoirs and interviews and the testimony of men like Hartman and Weber and thousands of others who expected brutality and found something different. They found law, they found rules, they found a nation that chose to follow Geneva Conventions even when following them was expensive, inconvenient, and unrewarded. They expected to be broken. Instead, they were treated as humans, and that treatment, not kind, not warm, but correct and dignified, changed how they understood war, peace, civilization, and themselves. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't violence, it's refusing to abandon humanity when abandoning it would be easier. The British learned that, and in learning it, they taught it to their prisoners, who carried that lesson home and tried to build a better Germany from what they'd seen. That's what dignity in wartime looks like. Not mercy, not friendship. Just the simple, stubborn insistence that even enemies deserve treatment according to law. And sometimes that's enough to change everything.